Now, before we get into more of this Roman Fourth Empire world that I was alluding to in the last video and the little horn, let's finish the book of Daniel with chapter 11, because this makes a direct connection between Antiochus, which is the little horn of chapter 8 and chapter 7, and the future prince. In the book of Revelations, they call the future prince the little horn also. So even though these horns represent different times in history, they all are parallel to each other. They describe these horns doing the same thing. Did you notice that the statue and the four beasts move from successive empire one to another, but then after the fourth empire, 10 kingdoms emerge, then God comes and sets up his kingdom. How can people say these prophecies have been fulfilled if God's kingdom is not here? So either you have a gap after the 10 toes, if they've already been done, and the 10 horns, and you're waiting for God's kingdom to come, or you have a gap after the fourth empire, and we're waiting for the 10 toes or 10 horns to show up before God's kingdom. There has to be a gap with one or the other. It has to be somewhere. So what I'm saying is we are in the fourth empire still. The fourth empire is the long legs. The fourth empire is the great terrible beast. That is our world. That has been the world ever since the Romans have taken over the known civilized world back then. This is the long gap. This is the fourth empire. And here in chapter 11 that we're going to cover, we see the same gap. We see a series of events, one after another. But then we move from our series of events to future end time events. It's the same theme through all of Daniel's visions. He always talks about Israel's near future and what's going to be taking place here very shortly, and then he moves into end time events. And then starting in chapter 11, he says that there's going to be 3 more kings that are going to rise in Persia. We don't need to get into those details, but history knows who they were. And then there will be a 4th one. And then he's going to arouse the whole empire of his realm against Greece. Okay, we know all that happened. It was the Greek-Persian Wars. And then we start talking about Alexander's empire and how it was divided up by his 4 generals. And then they fought over Israel for the next 200 years. Now, we're not going to go through the entire details, but this starts in verse 5. And if you take a look at it, if you have the time, it's real amazing the details they give you about both these empires. Now, no one in Daniel's day, or even I would say 50 to 100 years after Daniel wrote this, the events would be very difficult to recognize. And the details given here would not be able to be understood until far into the future. And we will see that Daniel even says we won't understand this. So, of course, these visions pertain to end times when he's given us the visions, but then says, we won't understand the prophecy till the end. Now, we do know, starting in verse 5, it starts talking about Alexander's 4 horns of his empire that were broken up into his 4 Greek generals. The king of the north is the Seleucid Empire under that general, which encompassed more than just Syria. It encompassed a wide tract of territory through Iraq, into Persia, into the Turkey area. Then they talk about the king of the south, which was his general Ptolemy, which that empire encompassed more than just Egypt. It traveled all across North Africa and into the Sudan area. Now, starting in verse 10, we start getting into Antiochus III, also known as the Great. And that will go up to verse 19. In verse 19, Antiochus the Great will be killed. And then there's another one taking his place. But starting in verse 21, this is what we're interested in. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Okay, this is Antiochus. This is the little horn. This is what the future horn's going to do. This is how he's going to take over. He doesn't come in by some giant war. He comes in and he's not a king, but he takes the kingship. Because when he talks about the despicable person 21, it's Antiochus, right? And he came to the throne when his brother Seleucus was murdered, and a son of this dead king who might succeed him was Demetrius the first. But he was being held hostage in Rome because of the situation Antiochus, his father, had with Rome, and they had to send hostages to Rome. Now, in this vacuum, because the king died, the son was in Rome, Antiochus seized power. Okay? It was not a battle. Now, everything we're going to read here is what Antiochus Epiphanes did, but this is what the future prince is going to do in the future. Because starting in verse 22, then it says, the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. Okay, they're talking about the Jews. Because the prince of the covenant was the high priest, Onias III, and he was murdered by his own defecting brother Menelaus. At the request of Antiochus, he bid for the throne, and Antiochus, because he gave him the most money, let Menelaus take over and had him murder the high priest. Then he makes an alliance. Okay, what does the future prince do according to Daniel chapter 9 verse 27? He makes an alliance. He makes an alliance, and he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. This is exactly what the future prince in the end time is going to be. And you know what they call him in Revelation, and we can just start calling him that. But I'm trying to just stay with the context and not jump ahead. But that future prince, of course, they call him the Antichrist. But this is how he's going to do it. Now in verse 24, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. They always say that, only for a time, because it's God's timetable, and he only allows people to go for so long, because there was a power struggle in Egypt, and this is what he was doing against the Egyptian Ptolemies. And by this alliance, he deceitfully plotted to gain power. With a small force, he conquered Memphis and the rest of Egypt, all the way up to Alexandria. Now, under the guise of friendship, he plundered the richest parts of Egypt, and he gained their support from the Egyptians by giving them gifts. So this is what Antiochus is doing. This is what the future prince is going to do. And then it goes on how these two leaders talk deceitfully against each other, even though they're sitting down at the same table, eating each other's food. Now, what I'm interested in is verse 28. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. Now, that's because as he's returning from Egypt, he goes through Israel, and there was a revolt going on because, of course, remember Menelaus had taken over? Now, of course, they don't talk of these details here in Daniel, but we know from history that he struck Jerusalem's temple. He profaned the sacrificial system. He massacred about 80,000 men. He took 40,000 prisoners, and he sold them as slaves. And he squelched this Jewish uprising against his appointed priest Menelaus. Now, I want to take note here. You see how he went into Rome, and he went into Jerusalem, and he plundered it, and he killed 80,000 men. A lot of people want to say that this future prince is like Pompey or some other leader that went into Jerusalem also, and Pompey had to go in. He laid siege to Jerusalem for like 3 years, and he ended up killing about 100,000 Jews, and he plundered the temple. Well, a lot of kings did that. You see how they do? You see how Antiochus did this, and he did this, but they're not saying that this is the abomination of desolation that the Jews are supposed to watch for. And I'll show you where that is. So there's a difference between, armies just plundering the temple and a difference between the abomination. Now, starting 29, he goes back to his, kingdom, but then he gets an army and he comes back to Egypt. But this time, it doesn't turn out like the last because Rome comes and gets him. That's where the ships here in verse 30, the ships of Kittim, that's Cyprus. And Rome controlled Cyprus, and that was one of their main bases in the east there. And they came against Antiochus. And, there's a story of how the Roman ambassador, Gaius Leonius, he presented Antiochus with an ultimatum. So he's standing in front of Alexandria, the city, right? He's outside of it, and he has, probably just his personal guard. And here's Antiochus coming with a huge army, and they go meet. And Leonius tells Antiochus that he can't conquer Egypt and to leave it alone and go back. And Antiochus is standing here in front of his whole army, and he's not sure what to do. And he says, well, I'll think about it. Let me get back to you. And Gaius takes a stick, and he walks around Antiochus, and he drew a circle around him. And he told him, before you leave out of this circle, I need to have your answer. And so Antiochus withdrew his army. It was a very embarrassing moment for him. And that's why in verse 30 it continues, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. In verse 31, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. And so what this means is Antiochus' soldiers were working with the apostate Jews, guarded the temple, halting all worship, while others attacked the city on the Sabbath, slaughtering men, women, and children. Soldiers desecrated the temple, they banned circumcision and the daily sacrifices, and they sacrificed a pig on the altar. They even imposed an idol statue in the honor of Zeus into the temple. Now, I went over this already, but Antiochus did all this, and this is the abomination of desolation. It's emptying or ruining the Jewish worship. And Daniel and Jesus both say, in Matthew 24:15, Jesus said it, that this was only a preview of the abomination that would happen later under the future prince. And we'll get into Jesus' quote later. Now, from 32 on to verse 35, we just talk about how eventually, with the Maccabean revolt, they were supported by Rome. Jews loyal to their God, they stood up and they kicked out the Hellenistic Jews, and they restored the temple to the daily sacrifices. Now, I want to note at the end of verse 35, some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time. Now, here's the jump. It jumps to the end time because it is still to come at the appointed time. So to me, Daniel's telling you, look, all this stuff is happening right now, and it's going to happen here in the near future to you. But people are still going to be refined and purged. That just means they're going to be tested. They're going to see who's going to remain true to God's insight. They're going to fall as martyrs. But the persecution pattern is going to continue until the final end time of Christ's second coming. This reference to the end time prepares us for the transition into verse 36, the final tribulation time with the future prince. Now look at 36. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Now, from verse 36 to 45, we're talking about the fulfillment of God's prophetic plan. All the stuff we've been talking about, Daniel, and how long it's going to last. In Daniel chapter 9, why the Jews are going to be uh, punished until the indignation is finished, for which is decreed. It's all planned out by God. Daniel's 70th week, which are found nowhere else in Scripture. And here in chapter 11, Antiochus Epiphanes, which is a forerunner of the Antichrist, is the perfect transition to show us into the future Antichrist. So between verse 35 and 36 here in chapter 11 is this gap. It jumps from, 164 BC, and then all of a sudden we're in the future uh, tribulation period, 2,000, 2,500 years later. It hasn't come yet, so we don't know the exact time. But there's the gap. It's in everywhere that I'll be showing you. And this future prince, it goes on to talk about, starting in 37, how he shows no regard for the gods of his father. That's because he worships a different God. There's no pagan worship here. He's not worshiping somebody else. This is worshiping himself. When I talked about earlier about how serious God is about sin, well, this man in the future, he is so serious about being worshiped. He will be the only one worshiped. In fact, he is so serious about it. I believe that's where it says he will have no desire of women or show regard for any other god. Now, people will say that's he's a homosexual, but I think it's more than that. He will have no desire for nothing on this earth except for the fact that everybody here is going to have to worship him. And if you don't, he's going to kill you. So this goes on all the way up to verse 39. And how he conquers and he takes over and he fights people, right? In verse 40, it does say at the end time, there is a huge war. And starting in verse 40, we see the reason that remember, there's reasons that they are telling us all these visions. It doesn't just pertain to the Israel people. It pertains to all of us. It pertains to what is going to happen at the end time. That's where they're giving this to us. Now, what happens in verse 40 can be a little controversial. I'm just going to tell you what I think. Now, you remember when the little horn comes up, we've already seen in Daniel chapter 7, he subdues 3 of those 10 kingdoms. I believe this is a line of those 3. Now, at the end time, there's a final north-south conflict here with the Antichrist stopping it. Now, at the end time, the king of the south, we know that's Egypt, right? That's what we've been reading, will collide with him. Well, who's the him? The him is the main subject we've been talking about. It's the Antichrist, that future prince. And then it says, and the king of the north will storm against him. Again, who's the subject? The Antichrist. So I believe both these north and south kingdoms decide to go at Israel. But the Antichrist can't have this. And I believe these horns, one of the horns are these 2 kingdoms, and he will subdue it. Because as you see, the Antichrist will prevail, and he will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. Now, what's interesting, just for a side note, is rescued out of the Antichrist's hands will be Edom, Moab, and the foremost sons of Ammon. And we'll talk about that later, okay? But just remember that these 3 countries are saved. But he will stretch his hands out against Egypt and a lot of other countries. But what's interesting is in verse 44, but rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. Okay, so there's the other 2 horns that he will destroy. So it's this Middle Eastern kingdom that's going to get destroyed by him. It will be an eastern kingdom, and it will be a farther northern kingdom. Those 3 horns will be subdued by him. Now, In verse 45, it says, he will, well, who's he? Again, it's the future prince, the Antichrist. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. That means he's going to come and he's going to settle where? He's going to settle in Israel. And what's the most important city here we're dealing with? It will be in Jerusalem. Yet, it says, he will come to his end and no one will help him. Now we're going to wrap up the book of Daniel with chapter 12. And it starts out by saying, now at that time. Now what time they're talking about? You have to go back to chapter 11. It's at the time when the future prince, the Antichrist, has taken over Israel, subdued 3 kings, and what's going to happen next. It says, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. Okay, that's the archangel Michael. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And just for reference, in the book of Jeremiah, remember we've been referring to Jeremiah and talking about how the Lord was punishing Israel for its disobedience and its harlotries. Well, in Jeremiah chapter 30 to 33, the Lord is telling Israel how he's going to restore her and makes promises to her. That's why God is not done with Israel. He has to fulfill his promises. And when you're talking about this great distress, this time of distress, in Jeremiah chapter 30, in verse 7, it says, alas, for that day is great. There is none like it. And it is the time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. So the Lord is letting the Israelites know, yes, it's going to be a great day of distress, but he will bring them through it. Now, the next section of verse 1 is controversial. I've heard pastors preach on this whole section right here of why Christians are going through the Great Tribulation. Because it says, I ended where it says, there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book will be rescued. So they say everyone written in the book, that's all saints, everybody is going to be rescued, meaning they're going to go through their tribulation. I don't read it like that. Okay, Daniel is talking about the Israelites and his people, and it says it says, and at that time your people, comma, everyone who is found written in the book will be rescued. To me, all that is saying is not only the Israelites, listen, all the Israelites aren't going to be saved. Every one of them that died in unbelief is going to be going into torment. Only his people and the ones that are written in the book of life are going to be saved. That's it. That's all that means. I'm not reading any more into that than what it says. Now it does say, it goes on to say that many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, some to everlasting life and some to disgrace and torment. Now that's just 2 groups. This is woven throughout the Bible. Now in verse 4 is what I'm interested in. And he says, but as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth and knowledge will increase. Now, of course, this is referring the end of time to the 70th week, the Great Tribulation. And this refers, when it's saying go back and forth, this is a Hebrew verb, and it always refers to the movement of a person searching for something. In the tribulation, people will search for answers to the devastation and discover what is happening through the book of Revelation. I also believe everything Daniel has written here, I mean, he's writing it down when he says, seal up the book until the end of time. It's, he's writing it down. It's in the scrolls. It's been there for 1,500 years. People can look at it. So it's not like he's hiding it. It just means that you're not going to understand what he's writing about until the time comes. I've been saying that since the beginning. You won't have the knowledge of what's happening here in the end times until it's happening. Also, when he tells Daniel to seal up the prophecy, it means he has no more prophecy to tell Daniel. That is the end. That's why you cannot listen to people who come up with mathematical equations from the Bible and all these numbers, how it works. There's not a hidden code in there. It doesn't work that way. The most famous one during my time was the Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, where he predicted that the end of the world would happen in 1988. And it didn't happen. And then he revised it like 3 more times, and none of it happened because it's not a mathematical equation. It just doesn't work that way. You have to have understanding of when things happen. You have to realize what you've been studying in the Bible and look and know that it's coming to pass. Now, what's interesting as you go on in this, when you get to the end of verse 7, it says, how long is this going to happen? And it says, for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. So there it is again. The times, we've already went over that. It's 3.5 years. The Antichrist is going to be allowed to devastate Israel in a great tribulation period in the 7 years for that 3.5 years. Remember, the tribulation is 7 years, right? The 70th week is 7 years. But in the middle of that week, that covenant gets broke, and the Israelites will be devastated for 3.5 years. And it says, until they're finished shattering the power of the holy people. So, yeah, he does go after all believers, all saints, and all Jews, and anybody that just doesn't follow him, period. Now, he repeats to Daniel again in verse 8, or actually in verse 9, go your way, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end of time. Now look at verse 11. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished, remember we talked about the abomination of desolation is set up, right? And it says, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. And there's one important fact I need you to recognize here. It's saying here that the regular sacrifice has to be abolished and the abomination of desolation committed again. That means the Israelites have to own Jerusalem, they have to control it, and they have to have a temple. Okay, well, the Israelites don't fully control Jerusalem. They just barely got their homeland back in 1948. And next video, we'll just touch on that a little bit, because this one I'm about done here, about how the Israelites came back to their homeland. But they have to have a temple, and that's not there yet. So, and this is what the Israelite people are to watch for. They're to watch for this abomination of desolation. Then they are to know the time is close and their Messiah will come conquering. And then we start talking about number of days again. So when the Antichrist breaks the covenant in the middle of that week, there's 3.5 years. In the Jewish days, there was only 360 days in their year. They didn't have the leap year and stuff like that. So it's 360 days. That's where we get 3.5 years. It's 1,260 days. But this says there will be 1,290 days from the time that the abomination and desolation is set up. Now, nobody really knows. Nobody knows why there's another 30 days added onto this. And it's just probably for, I would say, once it ends, within that 30 days or 30 days later, we're going to see the return of Jesus Christ. So, but no one really knows what that means. Then he says in verse 12, blessed are those who keep waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. And again, no one really knows what this means, but I believe this is 45 more days beyond the 1,290. And this could be, allows Jesus Christ, he says the words, it's Armageddon, which we'll go over all that. But from that time, there's a little feast it talks about. We'll go into that a little bit about the birds feasting on the dead bodies. So I think another 45 days, and then the millennial kingdom is set up. But again, this is all speculation. No one really knows what those extra times are. To recap, Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 11 are all visions and prophecies given to Daniel what was going to happen to his people in the past. But God has always given Israel examples that they are to follow that will point them to the future millennial kingdom. These chapters are doing the same thing. It did happen in the past, but it's pointing us to the future, what is going to happen. And in the next video, we are going to look at all four Gospels and what they recorded, what Jesus Christ, our Lord, had to say about this future event.